Once upon a time, in a land of the Hungary, there lived a princess. Princess Elizabeth was a very good little girl. Even as a child, she always had a kind word and showed quite a bit of concern for the poor. I don't know why I'm talking like this. Anyway, like many princesses of her time, she was betrothed while very young. She was 4. Now, to the modern day ear, that sounds cringy. But back then, it was very common in order to establish alliances and peace with nearby territories. She was married to her betrothed, Ludwig, Prince of Thuringia, which at the time was in the Holy Roman Empire, or today's Germany. This occurred when she was just 14 years old, which, again, to the modern ear, totally cringe. But it was a different time, and teenagers weren't exactly the self-finding, rebellious, yet dependent children they are today. Or when I was a teenager. They had responsibilities to maintain back then, were much more mature because of it, and Elizabeth was ready for marriage. She loved Ludwig very much. The two of them shared a deep concern for the poor, often distributing alms and food. Elizabeth would often gather loaves of bread from the royal pantry into her apron and go out to feed the needy. There was this particular time where she was on her way out to feed the poor when she ran across Ludwig. Ludwig saw that she had gathered up something in her apron and was like, "So what you carrying?" She opened up her apron, and where the loaves of bread had just been were now a bunch of beautiful roses. Elizabeth didn't just care for the poor, she cared for the sick as well. She is actually credited with building hospitals and hospices, but she also personally cared for the sick. In one instance, she escorted a leper to her and her husband's bedroom. She actually laid him down on their own bed. Ludwig was furious. He stormed into the room, probably to kick the leper out, but then God suddenly opened his eyes, and instead of the leper, he saw Jesus crucified. I bet that calmed him down pretty quickly, huh? Elizabeth was living quite the life. She loved her husband, loved her children, cared for her people, and most importantly, loved God. When she was 20 years old and pregnant with her 3rd child, the 6th Crusade was ramping up, and Ludwig felt duty-bound to defend the faith. He left for the Holy Land, but never reached it, dying of an illness, probably something along the lines of malaria or typhoid fever. Now, there was another man who had just died as well, but about a year before. He was in Italy, but news of him had spread outside of Italy and had reached other places throughout Europe, mostly because of what many thought was really bizarre behavior. The man had apparently renounced his inheritance, a very large inheritance, and lived out in nature, homeless, and having to beg for scraps of food. Oh, and he was also preaching to the birds. Now, if you watched last week's episode, this story should sound familiar to you. Yes, we're talking about the one and the only Saint Francis of Assisi. Having heard of this young man, and now a devastated young widow, Elizabeth followed in Francis's footsteps. She went radical in her devotion to the poor. She chose to live in poverty while feeding the hungry, tending to the sick, and living a life of self-denial. She would even join the Third Order of the Franciscans. full circle. At 24 years old, Elizabeth came down with a high fever, likely because of the amount of time she was spending with the sick. The fever lasted for about 10 days. All the while, a bird sat by her bedside and sang so sweetly that Elizabeth believed it to be a sample of what listening to the heavenly choirs would be like. A bird, huh? Remember when I said this? And he was also preaching to the birds. Preaching to the birds.
To the birds.
Coincidence? I think not. Anyway, as her disease got worse, she asked that the doors to her room be shut so she could be alone with God. She fell asleep and then never woke again. But like many saints whose stories we've covered on this channel, her story doesn't end here. So stick around, but before we move on, it's that time of the video where I ask you to please subscribe. And while you're at it, hit that like button. Don't forget to visit journeytosainthood.com, where we have some merch that would make great gifts. And this cool calendar where you can track the memorials and feast days of the very saints we go over right here on this channel. It's even got links to their specific videos when you click on the details there. I like to rewatch the videos on their particular day. Oh, and one more thing. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary's story was recommended to me in the comments section by a viewer. So, special thanks to Hobo Potato. That's fun to say. Hobo Potato. And now back to our show, already in progress. I think I may have just aged myself there. Elizabeth was buried in the chapel of the very hospice she had founded. Now, a hospice back then is not the same as it is now. It was used for a larger variety of things, but mainly for people in need. They served as shelters for the poor, gave medical care to the sick, and offered hospitality for pilgrims. Soon after she was buried in this hospice, the sick would go to her tomb and ask for her intercession. One by one, the faithful began to report miracle cures. These miracles were investigated, many confirmed, and just 4 years after her death, she was canonized a saint. She was moved to a newly built church called the Church of St. Elizabeth at Marburg. Word got out of all the healings going on at the Church of St. Elizabeth, and it became a major pilgrimage spot. For 300 years, the faithful would flock to her grave, and reports of miraculous healings continued. But alas, it would not last. Do you guys remember what was going on in the 16th century? I'll remind you, the Protestant Reformation. A Protestant Landgrave, which is like a German count, was in charge of the area. He really did not want anyone venerating saints. So he ordered Elizabeth's relics to be removed from the pilgrimage site and hidden. Now, when I say relics, I mean everything that had to do with her, including her body. You guys, to this day, we still do not know where they were moved. Her relics have never been recovered. As someone who has great love and respect for relics, and sometimes geeks out a little bit around them, maybe a lot, this upsets me. What are your thoughts on this? Leave them in the comments. St. Elizabeth's story is an example of why it's so important to venerate and appreciate the saints. Throughout her life, she loved God and his people. There's no denying that. But it was news of St. Francis of Assisi and his radical love for God that inspired St. Elizabeth to go radical and follow in his footsteps. So Jesus left behind the initial footsteps. And St. Francis Assisi followed those. So if St. Elizabeth is following St. Francis and St. Francis is following Jesus, then you see St. Elizabeth is following Jesus too. It's like a single file line. This is why we, as people who are called to be saints, need to follow the ones who came before us. Because by following them, we know, up at the front of the line, you guys, Christ is in the lead. That is why I call my playlist of saint stories Footsteps to Follow. Oh, and look, wouldn't you know, there's a place where you can click so you can watch those videos. How convenient. St. Elizabeth of Hungary, pray for us.